The battle in Berlin was an end phase of the Battle of Berlin. While the Battle of Berlin encompassed the attack by 3 Soviet army groups to capture not only Berlin but the territory of Germany east of the River Elbe still under German control. The battle in Berlin details the fighting and German capitulation that took place within the city. The outcome of the battle to capture the capital of the Third Reich was decided during the initial phases of the Battle of Berlin that took place outside the city. As the Soviets invested Berlin and the German forces placed to stop them were destroyed or forced back, the city's fate was sealed. Nevertheless, there was much heavy fighting within the city as the Red Army fought its way, street by street, into the center. On the 23rd of April 1945, the first Soviet ground forces started to penetrate the outer suburbs of Berlin. By the 27th of April, Berlin was completely cut off from the outside world. The battle in the city continued until the 2nd of May 1945. On that date, the commander of the Berlin defense area, General Helmut Weidling, surrendered to the commander of the Soviet 8th Guards Army, Lieutenant General Vasily Chukov. Chukov was a constituent of Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belo-Russian Front. Prelude. Battle of the Oder-Neisse. The sector in which most of the fighting in the overall battle took place was the Seelow Heights, the last major defensive line outside Berlin. The Battle of the Seelow Heights was one of the last pitched battles of World War II. It was fought over 4 days, from the 16th of April until the 19th of April 1945. Close to 1 million Soviet soldiers and more than 20,000 tanks and artillery pieces were in action to break through the gates to Berlin, which was defended by about 100,000 German soldiers and 1,200 tanks and guns. On the 19th of April, the 4th day, the First Belo-Russian Front broke through the final line of the Seelow Heights and nothing but broken German formations lay between them and Berlin. Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front, having captured Forst the day before, was fanning out into open country. One powerful thrust was heading northwest towards Berlin while other armies headed west towards a section of United States Army front line, southwest of the city who were on the Elbe. By the end of the 19th of April the German Eastern Front line north of Frankfurt around Seelow and to the south around Forst had ceased to exist. These breakthroughs allowed the 2 Soviet fronts to envelop the German IX Army in a large pocket east of Frankfurt. Attempts by the IX Army to break out to the west would result in the Battle of Halb. The cost to the Soviet forces had been very high between 1 and the 19th of April, with over 2,807 tanks lost, including at least 727 at the Seelow Heights. Encirclement of Berlin on the 20th of April, Adolf Hitler's birthday. Soviet artillery of the 79 Rifle Corps of the First Belo-Russian Front first shelled Berlin. Thereafter, Soviet artillery continued the bombardment of Berlin and did not stop until the city surrendered. After the war, the Soviets pointed out that the weight of explosives delivered by their artillery during the battle was greater than the tonnage dropped by the Western Allied bombers on the city. The First Belo-Russian Front advanced towards the east and northeast of the city. The First Ukrainian Front had pushed through the last formations of the northern wing of General Ferdinand Schorner's Army Group Center and had passed north of Jüterbog, well over halfway to the American front line on the River Elbe at Magdeburg, to the north between Stettin and Schwedt. Konstantin Rokossovsky's Second Belo-Russian Front attacked the northern flank of General Gotthard Heinrich's Army Group Vistula, held by Hasso von Manteuffel's 3 Panzer Army. By the 24th of April, elements of the First Belo-Russian Front and the First Ukrainian Front had completed the encirclement of the city. The next day, the 25th of April, the Second Belo-Russian Front broke through 3 Panzer Armies' line around the bridgehead south of Stettin and crossed the Rando Swamp. They were now free to move west towards the British 21st Army Group and north towards the Baltic port of Stralsund. The Soviet 58th Guards Division of Zhadov's 5th Guards Army made contact with the U.S. 69th Infantry Division of the 1st Army near Torgau, Germany. On the Elbe River, the Soviet investment of Berlin was consolidated with leading units probing and penetrating the S-Bahn defensive ring. By the end of the 25th of April, there was no prospect that the German defense of the city could do anything but temporarily delay the capture of the capital by the Soviets, as the decisive stages of the battle had already been fought and lost by the Germans fighting outside the city. Preparation. On the 20th of April, Hitler ordered, and the Wehrmacht initiated, Clausewitz, which called for the complete evacuation of all Wehrmacht and SS officers in Berlin. This essentially formalized Berlin's status as a frontline city. The forces available to Artillery General Helmut Weidling for the city's defense included several severely depleted Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS divisions. In all about 45,000 men. These formations were supplemented by the police force, boys in the compulsory Hitler Youth, and the Volkssturm. Many of the 40,000 elderly men of the Volkssturm had been in the army as young men, and some were veterans of World War I. Hitler appointed SS Brigadier Führer Wilhelm Mock commander of the city's central government district. Mock's command post was in bunkers under the Reich Chancellery. The core group of his fighting men were the 800 members of the Leibstandarte Guard Battalion. He had a total of over 2,000 men under his command. Weidling organized the defenses into 8 sectors designated A, 2, H, each commanded by a colonel or a general, but most had no combat experience. The XX Infantry Division was to the west of the city, the IX Parachute Division to the north, the Panzer Division Müncheberg to the northeast, the SS Panzer Grenadier Division Nordland to the southeast, and to the east of Tempelhof Airport. The reserve, 18th Panzer Grenadier Division, was in Berlin's central district. Tactics and terrain. A Soviet combat group was a mixed arms unit of about 80 men in assault groups of 6 to 8 soldiers, closely supported by field artillery. These were tactical units which were able to apply the tactics of house-to-house fighting that they had been forced to develop and refine at each Festungsstadt they had encountered from Stalingrad. The German tactics used for urban warfare in Berlin were dictated by 3 considerations: the experience that they had gained during 5 years of war, the physical characteristics of the city, and the methods used by the Soviets. Most of the central districts of Berlin consist of city blocks with straight wide roads and contain several waterways, parks and large railway marshalling yards. It is a predominantly flat area, with some low hills such as the Kreuzberg, which is 66 meters above sea level. Much of the housing stock consisted of apartments blocks built in the second half of the 19th century. Most of those, thanks to housing regulations and few elevators, were 5 stories high and built around a courtyard that could be reached from the street through a corridor large enough to accommodate a horse and cart or a small delivery truck. In many places, these apartment blocks were built around several courtyards, one behind the other. Each reached through the outer courtyards by a ground-level corridor similar to that between the first courtyard and the road. The larger, more expensive flats faced the street, while the smaller, more modest dwellings were grouped around the inner courtyards. Just as the Soviets had learned a lot about urban warfare, so had the Germans. The Waffen-SS did not use a makeshift barricades erected close to street corners, because these could be raked by artillery fire from guns firing over open sites further along the straight streets. Instead, they put snipers and machine guns on the upper floors and roofs because the Soviet tanks could not elevate their guns that high, and simultaneously they put men armed with Panzerfausts in cellar windows to ambush tanks as they moved down the streets. These tactics were quickly adopted by the Hitler Youth and the First World War Volkssturm veterans. Initially, Soviet tanks advanced down the middle of the streets, but to counter the German tactics, they altered their own and started to hug the sides of the streets. The Soviets also mounted submachine gunners on the tanks who sprayed every doorway and window, but this meant the tank could not traverse its turret quickly. Another solution was to rely on heavy howitzers firing over open sites to blast defended buildings and to use anti-aircraft guns against the German gunners on the higher floors. Soviet combat groups started to move from house to house instead of directly down the streets. They moved through the apartments and cellars, blasting holes through the walls of adjacent buildings, while others fought across the rooftops and through the attics. These enfilading tactics took the Germans lying in ambush for tanks in the flanks. Flamethrowers and grenades proved to be very effective, but as the Berlin civilian population had not been evacuated, these tactics inevitably killed many.